Alright, I'm back. This is Talking to Myself Gaming. I am talking to myself. This is the podcast wherein I play some game that I can lose my mind to and talk to myself. And, oh goodness, I go right immediately. I keep doing this, going right into narrative sections in these games that I can't skip the narrative. And so, it'll let me speed it up the narrative. So, while we're here, I'm going to disclose to you in honesty that I don't really know entirely what I want to talk about today. I just know that I've taken last week off, and I've done some reading, and I've done some thinking, and I've done some educating, and I don't know what the thinking is, but I've done some learning. Not some educating, some being educated. Oh, boss fight. Interesting. Okay. I've been doing some being educated this week. I finished the Quest for Meaning Great Lectures course, and I have been listening to, for the last 18 hours of my listening time, I just finished another Great Lectures course. This one called The Long 19th Century, about the 19th century. And what I'm feeling and what I'm thinking about, having done that, is I'm feeling annoyed. And what I'm thinking about is that I'm annoyed that I spent so long on that lecture series and the lecturer spent so long talking about World Wars I and II. My major takeaway from having listened to that lecture series is that I didn't know that World Wars I and II were in the 1800s. I felt very confident, in fact, before listening to that lecture series, that World Wars I and II were in the 20th century. I thought that the 19-teens and the 1940s and 30s were in the 1900s, but lo and behold, turns out they're in the 1800s. So, I went into that lecture series hypothesizing to myself that it seems like, from what I've read and what I've learned and what I already know from having experienced it firsthand, it seems to me like Europe was traumatized during the 20th century. I was going to say during the second millennium, but that's a long time. And would be false, because that would be 1000 to 2000. Anyway, in the 20th century. What am I doing? Why am I... Europe was traumatized by the First and Second World Wars. And I don't think that's obvious to everyone. I think that... How do I want to say this? Because I'm trying to talk about I'm trying to put into words what I already knew and what I was hypothesizing, and this game for the first time wants to give me a long narrative section. So that's unfortunate that it wants to do this while I'm trying to think, because this is the kind of thing that I want the game to do when I don't want to think. So I think Europe was traumatized, and I don't think that that's obvious to everyone. I don't think it's obvious to Europe as such, and I don't think it's obvious to young Europeans especially. But there's also a cultural, even a genetic memory here in the United States of when Europe wasn't shell-shocked. And so I went into this hypothesizing that a lot of what I've been talking about to myself in this podcast is conversations that America is having with itself, because America hasn't been able to actually meaningfully talk with Europe for 100 years or more, because, well, more than that actually. Okay, so I'm just gonna stop talking about my hypothesis, because I think that what I've hypothesized, I think that what I've noticed is that Europe doesn't know its past. We don't know that Europe doesn't know their past, and we're just circle jerking between the two civilizations, between the two hemispheres. Not really, the East and West hemispheres. I don't know what hemisphere. I don't know what I mean. Between the two continents, the two land masses, the two peoples. Because well, I've always got the impression that Europe forgets that we left Europe because we thought we could do what Europe had been doing better. And so I think there's a genetic memory of, I know there's a genetic memory. There's a genetic memory in the United States of being a backwater. Like, throughout the lecture series that I just finished, The Long 19th Century, because he's talking to Americans about Europe, I think he assumes a deeper ignorance of Europe than what exists. But anyway, his information's also outdated. I saw that Audible said that it was first published on 2013, but that might have been when it first went to Audible, because it seemed like 1999 politics, what he was saying. But he would also tell you that his cultural biases are Jewish, and so he wouldn't have much personal interest in the 19th century, because the 19th century was just finishing what the Reconquista of Spain began, and was telling Jews to either convert to Christianity and become Christians and become European, or get the hell out and become your own people somewhere else. And he didn't want to talk about anything really other than that the Jews were mistreated. And it just became a pattern to me of every time it would come up, he would just be critical of the country for not letting Jews live, which is bad. That's being a bad historian, because you're not trying to understand the context of the people that are making these choices. Like, it's because if he asks, well, why were Jews persecuted, or why were Jews kicked out, or why were Jews, mistreated historically, he would have to answer the question honestly, and he would have to make changes in his own behavior. And none of us is willing to do that. It has nothing to do with being Jewish, but that particular behavior is why the Jews kept getting kicked out, is because the Jews would say to their greater culture, no, we're the chosen people, we're who God wants, we're better than you in some fundamental way, but then not act it, not actually claim it. They would do things like taking your donations and then telling you to fuck off and blocking you. It's like, okay, well, you'll take my money, but you won't listen to my critique of what you're doing. So yeah, nobody wants people like that around. I keep talking about this, and it keeps getting earlier and earlier in my videos, because obviously it's because I'm thinking about it and I'm seeing it. And not saying it, a lie of omission is still a lie. So like acting like an untruth is the truth because it's polite is lying, and lying is worse than being impolite. Being impolite is just being what do they call it? Disagreeable, and being disagreeable sometimes is the only thing that can keep your nation from being destroyed by Nazis. So like, one of the things that the lecturer talks about frequently is Bismarck. He talks about Bismarck a lot, and I didn't really learn anything about Bismarck. I didn't feel like I got to know Bismarck in a greater way, I did not enjoy this lecture. It had nothing to do with his Jewish biases. I mean, it had a lot to do with his Jewish biases, but I don't know. When there's a hatred, when you have a hatred for the people that you're talking about, that you're teaching, that you're lecturing about, you can't learn about them, and you can only teach what we already know. You can't come to any greater depth of understanding of where their civilizations went wrong. So, like, for instance, what I found myself thinking obsessively about in the shower, and which ultimately led to this, is I was like, oh, I'm not doing that no thinking thing. I'm thinking thoughts that I'm never going to be able to reclaim again. I'm never going to be able to have back. So I sat down and tried to get this set up for an hour, and I was getting audio recording through my Aver for a while. But then when I got it all set up and I got it configured to where, all right, I got my audio, I'm actually going to be able to record the game audio this time without it being through the mic. And so I'll have 2 audio files this time to work with. It turned out that my Aver was no longer capturing video. So when I got it to capture video again, naturally, with the incoming of the video, out went the audio. And so, in that time, I was able to forget what I was thinking about and what I wanted to talk to myself about. And so, what did I say that I was thinking about in the shower? I was thinking about suffrage, and I was thinking about where the 19th century really went wrong. And where the 19th century really went wrong was by pursuing universal male suffrage, because I tweeted something out about how... I tweeted out, I saw a tweet come across my dashboard about how it's a woman being ironic about how it's hard for women out there, and it was a hypergamist woman talking about a man who's in her caste. She was clearly Indian, but a man who's in the appropriate caste for her to marry, but who makes many, many, many times less dollars per year, fewer dollars per year than she and her family. And the poster that brought it to my attention, not the original poster, but the reposter that brought it to my attention, was being ironic about how, it's hard for women out here. And it's like, well, yeah, for hypergamists it is, because she can, the Mahabharata and every wisdom tradition is very clear that women who marry at or below their social station are only dissatisfied by the marriage. Those marriages that are between partners where the male is at or below the female's social station, that means income, but it also means social hierarchy, whatever the social hierarchy. If she has a better job than he does, if she makes more money than he does, if she comes from a better family than he does, the marriage always ends in acrimonious divorce. Always. And usually not even acrimonious divorce, frequently murder. Frequently those marriages end in murder. So it is, in fact, hard for a hypergamist out there. It is, because she knows that he's either going to spend all of her money, take all of her wealth, and squander it, because he's going to live a better life just by being married to her, or she's going to be so frustrated with his lack of ambition, talent, and skill that she's going to murder him. She's going to poison him to get away from him. Because when women have the kind of obsessive thoughts that I have, they're pre-verbal and they end in poisonings. This is why men die in their sleep so frequently. It's funny because I've been married. And if you haven't been married and you're hearing me talk about this, you just don't know. You just don't know. And so you can't have an opinion. And so I was thinking, and this is my way of getting to talking about universal male suffrage, because basically the only things that he wanted to talk about. My lecturer, the lecturer. Well, you say my teacher, right? My lecturer, the lecturer. He basically all he wanted to talk about was the irony of universal male suffrage, like it's ironic, or that universal suffrage is ironic because it didn't include women. But it's like that, and I understand. And I left a scathing negative review about that lecture course. They should take it down. It's outdated socially. His social commentary is extremely outdated. His he uses the word retard about 5 or 10 times, so I no longer have to feel bad for using the word retarded ironically. He uses the word retarded very frequently. It should be taken down, but I read other reviews, and I wasn't the only person who felt the various things that I felt and thought the various things that I've thought about the lectures. And so that's vindicating in a certain way, right? Not being the only person who thinks and feels the things that you think and feel, that is vindication. But he wasn't trying to get into the philosophy and the thoughts and the whys and the hearts and the minds of the people that he was discussing. He was trying to get you to read assigned reading, and he was commenting on the assigned reading like I had read it. And that's fine in a lecture hall. That's fine in a lecture hall classroom, but the great courses lectures aren't. They're not a lecture hall classroom. It's meant to feel intimate, one-on-one with the teacher, and when they give you supplemental reading, it's supposed to be suggested supplemental reading, not actual supplemental reading that I have to read the reading in order to get anything from the course. Other people said that. My critique is that it felt that way too, because he really didn't get into the, if I wanted to know how the various philosophers and various artists and all these things that he kept mentioning and kept saying were a part of it, like he kept talking about Marxist art and Leninist art and socialist art, but he never talked about the direct impacts. He just talked about how it would show up eventually, or how it did show up, and I was disappointed in that. So the next lecture I'm going to listen to naturally is that. It's the art and great minds of the 19th century, which is what I actually wanted to know about. I didn't want to know about the movements of the armies and the various wins and various defeats, and how the 19th century directly led into his actual expertise, being a Jew during World War II. Which is interesting because, well, his family it's interesting to a different conversation, which is maybe an entirely different podcast, but it's what I'm thinking about, and I'm trying to figure out how to make these disparate thoughts that I've had verbal. And his family were Russian, and he even talks about it, that the Nazis were liberators of the Jews in Russia. So they weren't seen as villains. They were seen as the good guys, even while they were exterminating Jews in their own country, because it was never about Jews. Like the narcissism of the Jewish people to assume that it's actually about them. It's about the economy. It's about, like, he kept talking about nationalism and the growth of nationalism and nationalistic identities. Like we already have well-founded, as in good, assumptions about nationalism, but we didn't learn the lessons of nationalism during the Cold War. I mean, that's very obvious. That's very clear if you learn about the family. Like if you watch that The Family documentary. I can't remember what the guy's name is. He's passed now, rest his soul, but he is the only person in the United States that figured out that we're in a war of ideology still. The World War II, just because we defeated the Nazis and just because the Berlin Wall came down didn't mean that we weren't still in an open conflict with ideology. That the United States wasn't still in the midst of a worldwide civil war over ideology, and we act today like it's not true. I watched my world act like it wasn't true during I watched my world. The United States was my world, and everyone in it, everyone around me act like the terrorist stuff of the Bush administration wasn't ideology, and I watched all of my generational cohort, people my own age and younger, act like the Obama si se puede, yes you can, wasn't an ideology, wasn't a war of ideology, that the grassroots, it wasn't grassroots, the AstroTurf and Tea Party movements of the 2010s that wasn't about ideology. That was about maintaining a Cold War ideology. America first ideology. We act like Trump isn't toting an ideology with "Make America Great Again." Like we act like ideology isn't a thing. And the reason that we act like ideology isn't a thing, I understand now, is because educated people, that is, people with a college education, are European socialists. You're all European socialists. And so what I should have just sat down and I should have done what I did for the last, and I should have just taken notes, and I should have made like a numbered list. Seven ways that this lecture series confirmed my pre-verbal suspicions about the world today. Because one of the things that I've noticed in observing American Democrats is that they have Europe envy. American Democrats have Europe envy. And so what I was trying to say earlier, and I got all tangled up on myself, is that there's a genetic memory in the United States of the United States being an unimportant and ignorable, or even ignoble, because we did lack nobility, backwater. We were. He kept saying, I began this. He kept saying that the United States, the American continents may as well, but especially the United States, from the perspective of an American listening to a lecture about the 19th century Europe, well, the 19th century world, but he didn't really have any interest in talking about Asia or Asia Minor, the Indian subcontinent at all. He talked a lot about Africa, but really only I've gotten off track again. Anyway, we may as well have been on the moon. We were unimportant, and we remained unimportant until long after World War II. It wasn't until the 80s that the United States became important on the world stage. That's the reason, in fact, that we Americans have a longing to return to the 80s, is because in the 80s, globalist economic politics, including Bismarckian secret like spy politics, couldn't lose. And so the world just did whatever the United States wanted. And it wasn't until the market crash of 2008 that the world went, you know what, maybe playing fast and loose with the world economy and world politics isn't a good idea. We, the world that isn't the United States, did this only a century ago, and it ended in a devastating world war. Like, one of the stats that he wants to give, and one of the things that's true from an American perspective, is that France cratered under the Nazi and the German invasion. They cratered. And not only did they crater, but there was very little resistance among the civilians, the civilization, the people. There was very little resistance to fight back, even among the occupation. Like, there was very, very little resistance to the Nazi nobility enjoying themselves in Paris as kings. But from an American perspective, that seems like, you know, what do we call the French? That seems like surrender monkey-ness. That seems like being a surrender monkey or being a coward. Only if you don't know what happened in the previous century. So, like, it wasn't just what. I listened to, several years ago when I was beginning this process, I listened to Winston Churchill's memoirs, and now I was thinking about this as I was listening to that lecture series, and he kept talking about World Wars I and II instead of the 19th century. I was thinking about how I don't really remember much from those memoirs because I didn't have anyone to talk to about them. My girlfriend at the time had the opposite of an interest in me, and the people that I worked with were gas station attendants who were much more interested in celebrities and getting high than World War II memoirs. But my memory is that I remember being struck by Winston Churchill saying of the French that they just didn't have anyone left alive with fight in them, and the people who were responsible for having fight were exhausted by World War I. They were just exhausted by the weight of that war. And if you know anything about the way World War I went, I mean, that's only to be expected, that people, the French people, were exhausted by and collapsed under the weight of the First War. But it wasn't just the First War that they collapsed under, because that's an insufficient and uninteresting explanation for what happened with that people. What am I doing wrong? Shoot flames. Why am I not shooting flames? I thought it said I could shoot flames. How does one shoot yonder flames? Okay. I'm doing something wrong again. Does it have... Here. What am I doing wrong? Bingo. Golly gee, I'm so smart. Oh, it's a whole new weapon. Neat. Me gusta. Interesting. Oh, no. Oh, okay. I don't remember what I was talking about. It gone. But I bet I can now. Light. No? Still none? I thought that this would light on fire if I hit it with this. Nope. Why you no light on fire? Whatever I was talking about is just gone now. I was working my way sort of thing and it's just gone now. They collapsed under the weight of the wars. I heard that a statistic I'd never heard before, that the French male population, 50% of them died during World War I, and another 25 were permanently maimed. That it went from French girls being able to get married and have families to there being no males. So when in the next generation the Nazis showed up with this half-starved, mad population that boomed during the Depression era because there was nothing to do but fuck, there was no hope of fighting back. It wasn't even that they were exhausted. They were dead. They didn't have the population. It's the exact opposite of what I was explaining to you when I said that the reason that England capitulated to India and to Mahatma Gandhi had nothing to do with human rights and suffrage and these things. That's what I'm trying to say about universal male human rights. That was never anything. That was never the goal. And so here's what I'm annoyed about. I bought that lecture. Here's what I'm doing. I know what's going on. I understand what I'm thinking and what I'm feeling now. I bought that lecture because a couple of weeks ago, either the week before or the week before that, is how I think in terms of weeks, I heard the phrase enlightened despotism associated with the 18th and 19th, but specifically the 19th century, and I thought, I'd never heard that before. I would like to learn about enlightened despotism. And so, as per usual, I'm about 33 minutes in. I'm about a quarter of the way through how long I want to be talking about today, because I actually have errands. I'm actually doing this on a schedule. I have things to be doing, so I need to be done with this at the 2-hour mark today. And I realize what I'm thinking about. What I'm thinking about is enlightened despotism. And no Jewish person is going to want to talk unironically about enlightened despotism. In fact, no Jewish person is going to want you to leave a lecture series with the concept of enlightened despotism in your mind. But what is enlightened despotism? It seems like a good start, because I didn't learn about it, so I don't really know. I can't really tell you what it is. But the idea is that despots, that is, totalitarian leaders, so really kings and emperors, but the emperor distinction by 1900 was, how do I want to say this? Not genuine. Like, it was the kind of thing that Wilhelm called himself, and it was passé even by Wilhelm. Of World War I Germany. Okay, so the enlightened despot, the idea was that it came from the Habsburgs, or maybe whether it came from the Habsburgs or the Habsburgs just embraced it more totally than their contemporaries or others. I don't actually know. I haven't studied the Habsburgs in detail yet. I don't know that I love this sword. Oh, I just do. Wait. I'm confused. So, equipping this means I have to use the sword? No. I see it. Cannot wield both simultaneously, so I can switch them? Yes! Sweet! I like this one better. It's faster. An enlightened despot, the idea was, and the idea remains true, the idea holds true, that the only people who have time to become enlightened, and enlightenment is what the woke claim, right? Enlightenment is to be woke. But enlightenment is where, is it the seeing the light, right? It's the seeing the light, right? It's where you understand the light of truth. You've seen the light of truth. You understand reality as it is. Not as it appears and not as it might be, but as, it in fact is. And so the idea was that because of the facts of life, because of the fact of the struggle of survival, the only people who could become enlightened, in fact, were the rich and the elite. And the idea was that the only people who could become truly enlightened in a meaningful sense were the monarchs, because the only people who could train their children to behave as though they were enlightened were monarchs. Because the idea behind, okay, and another reason that a Jewish historian wouldn't like the idea of the enlightened of an enlightened despot, or even wouldn't like the idea of the possibility of enlightened despotism, is because it's a claim to Christhood. It's a claim to messianism. It's a claim to being chosen by God to rule. And there's only one people who are chosen by God to rule, and that's the Jews. So no Jewish person by their own bias would ever allow that a non-Jew could be an enlightened despot. That's why they're encouraging Netanyahu to be an enlightened despot in Israel right now. And it's interesting because I've learned more recently about the history and the formation of that country, and that has always been the case. They've always wanted a totalitarian Bronze Age kingdom in that country. The people who are against that are the atheists. And one thing that I keep finding myself thinking is that, of course Jewish people would, would make a distinction between religiously and culturally Jewish, because culturally Jewish, it means, what it means. It means you're genetically the same people as the practicing Jews. But to be culturally but not ethnically Jewish is a renunciation of the claim of chosenness, right? And so that's why they're unthreatening. And no one minds a cultural Jew anymore. But that's what I'm talking about, we used to think that the cultural Jew and not the practicing Jew. The practicing Jew we weren't bothered by. It was the cultural Jew that was actually the bother in the pre-current era, in the what is known as the modern era, the century that I just finished learning about. They were worried about the cultural Jew because the cultural Jew could hold a secret ambition of being the Jewish Messiah, of being Jesus. Because, one thing we don't talk about, and they don't talk about, and they don't want us to think about, us descendants of Christians to think about, is that, to be a Jew means to hold out that you are the Messiah. Because every Jewish person is called to become the Messiah. That's the point. Every Jewish person is called to, every practicing Jewish person is called to lift Israel out of bondage. And in lifting Israel out of bondage, that means to make Israel the dominating world power, the capital, to make Jerusalem specifically the capital of a world empire. And so cultural Jews, they deny this. They say, no. We're just a genetic people, and that's old religious stuff, and nobody believes that, but people believe that shit. Whether they understand that they believe it or not, their faith, if you practice the faith, is, and I'm getting to a point about enlightened despotism. Their faith is to raise every Jewish child as the Messiah, as the child that's going to liberate and perfect being a Jew. And you can see it in their culture. That's what makes them aspirational, inspirational, and enviable. Right? This is why people don't like Jews, because Jewish mothers raise all of their children as though they're special, not just their firstborn. Right? This is aspirational shit. And people hate them because you love that thing you hate that thing which is closest to what you love, but not the thing that you love. And so people hate, I don't hate Jews, but other people hate Jews because Jews make them self-critical. They see in the love for all of the Jewish children by the Jewish parent and the Jewish grandparents and the Jewish community, all of Abraham's children. There was that song that we used to sing when I was a kid. Many sons had Father Abraham, right? Father Abraham had many sons had Father Abraham. I am one of them, and so are you, right? And so that was the idea, is that we were all. And that's what I'm trying to tell you, bonded Christianity. Well, after the Protestant Reformation, Christianity was no longer bonded, right? So you, in the pre-Protestant world, in the medieval world, you could be a practicing Christian and a cultural Christian. That went away with the Protestant Reformation, with the wars in France and Germany and England and elsewhere over religious tolerance. And what those wars determined was that you could no longer be an atheist. You could no longer be agnostic. You could no longer be an observing but not practicing religious person. That's what whatever religion you practice, that's what those wars determined. And I've talked about how that's a fact because I've talked about relativism, what those wars leading up to and culminating with World War II, and in fact, what I really want to get, and what I've been thinking about, is how the Cold War, it continues to be an extension of the wars of not just World Wars I and II, but the wars of Napoleon in the 19th century. That war, that whole century, the 20th century, is the cognitive dissonance of the 19th century. We refuse to learn the lessons even of the French Revolution. Oh, I died. I don't know why, but I died. One of the things that I found remarkable is that no one wants to admit, and in the United States we don't want to talk about, how the French Revolution was a political coup by Americans to destabilize the European economy. Because if the European economy was destabilized, then our pirates, our smugglers, and our privateers isn't who I mean. Our shippers, would make more money. Because we didn't help France rebel, and France, the republic that France came up with, was nothing like the American Republic. The government that France gave itself is absolutely nothing like the government that the Americans fought for and gave themselves in the American Revolution. So if you look at how we bankrupted them by having them give us all of our money so we could fight the English, and then they in fact bankrupted, that looks to me like a political conspiracy. Like, that doesn't happen by accident. You don't take all of a nation's money so that it can't fight back by accident, especially when you've got somebody like old Ben Franklin over there in their country keeping an eye on things. Like, he knew the French people as well as the French, so I don't believe for a second that it was an accident that France's economy tanked. Because I've been telling you that the United States, since World War I, has been concerned with the world economy, has been concerned with France and Germany's economies not tanking so that the world economy doesn't tank. But the reason we were afraid at the time of the world economy tanking, and since then it's changed, but the reason we were afraid at the time of the world tanking is because we made all of our money on shipping. We made all of our money by buying things cheap and selling them high back to Europe. And you can't do that. You can't do that if Europe has no buying power. And so what I wanted to say earlier is that listening back to this lecture on the 19th century, even though it was bad, is interesting. Was interesting to me in the context of the assertion that the author of Why Liberals Win the Wars Even When They Lose the Elections, he said something that I found very interesting, is that no matter what else we disagreed on, our founding fathers and our government through all of time, that's actually not true anymore. It won't be true anymore, but through most, let's say through the 80s, that the one thing that our politicians could agree on was that we weren't French, and we wouldn't behave as though we were French. And that was funny to me. And it just made me laugh every time he gave an example of the two aisles, the left and the right in the United States, the two parties agreeing to at least not be French. I found all of those highly amusing, but I didn't really have any context for what it meant. I didn't really know what it meant to be French, right? Other than we haul French, right? Other than to be pretentious and a snob. But that can't be what all French people are like. That's clearly what a certain caste of Parisian is like. So what did it mean, I wondered, to be French politically? And so listening to this long 19th century has at least been interesting to answer that question, because that question has an answer. It definitely has. It has one answer, and what it means to be French is to prefer to spend more than market rates on simple shit that you don't need to spend market rates on. So what that means is to buy second market guns that have already been raised in price through tariffs multiple times, right? Same gun, it's just 3 times the cost. That makes it a better gun to the French. And giving absolutely zero fucks about the poor. Absolutely zero fucks. That's what it means to be French. And so in the United States, when we said that it was absolutely unacceptable to be French, what we meant is that our government was not going to spend anything more than less if it could, and that we were going to give a fuck about the poor. And so it's interesting to me now, what with our government shutdown, it's interesting to me that the idea of government labor, of a government being able to provide jobs that keep the people working, that kind of New Deal democracy that that libertarians use to hearken back on. I'm not a libertarian, but I realize that neither Democrats nor Republicans used to want the thing that I'm about to say as I began to accuse them of it. Oh no. So my only choice is to kill my way through this as fast as possible then. That's crazy. Because I have to heal. But if I leave to heal, they're going to spawn back. Yeah, look, I'm dead. Because I don't have any way to heal. I do not know what the game wants me to do here. I'm clearly missing an item. The fruit that thing wants. No, this doesn't prevent me from taking damage. And it doesn't make me do so much more damage that I can actually kill these things quickly enough to survive this shit. Because I'm gonna die just of the exposure before I even get to the top. Yeah. Look, I'm gonna... What the hell does it want me to do here? Oh, what if I can play the harmonica in this room? It has no effect. Okay. So that's not it. Oh. I have to talk to someone else about that one. So what if I do this? I should edit out when I do this, but I'm not going to. So the last thing that I remember saying is that France gives no fucks about their poor. And so that's the kind of thing that you think when you're me needs qualification that I need to prove in some way. Prove. Rah! Oh man, I just had my own, what was that Democrat guy? Howard Dean? I just had my own Howard Dean scream there. Oh, that was an ugly note. There's always that crystal thing if things get out of hand, she says. So I have to get up here to the... I have no choice, is what it's telling me. I have to get up here and meet this thing. Let's get back to not solving problems or puzzles, and then I can try to think about what I'm thinking about. Because what I'm thinking about is being French. And that the French are allowed to be French because the French are the French. And one of the things on my mind always is what I was talking about vis-a-vis the Russians. Like, like, if the United States had in fact conquered the entire world, who are the United States politicians or diplomats to decide how the various states that they conquer are reorganized and how they should run? And so what I'm thinking about, and I don't know how to get there. I don't know how to close the gap on France being France and America agreeing not to be France. I don't know that there is a gap. I just know that it was interesting listening to 19th century France, learning about 19th century France in that context, because the not giving a shit about the poor thing didn't change with democracy. What changed isn't that they began to give a shit about the poor. What changed is that democracy, and I don't think historians like to say this. I think that historians are loath, in fact, to say this. I think that what democracy gave France was willing sacrifices. So I was talking about magic in my first episode, maybe several of them, right? And so the French are where our ideas of black magic come from. The French nobility were practicing wizards and had been practicing users of magic, or at least they had been practicing users of magicians for hundreds of years. And so a lot of their worldview, like a lot of Descartes, is esotericism. Because when northern and southern France, what we call northern and southern France, when Burgundy and the region around Marseille, I think that's called the Languedoc, when Burgundy and the Languedoc and Rennes up in the northwest, so Normandy, I think, what's that called? That's also something like the Languedoc. They have similar names, but they're at opposite sides of the country, the landmass. But when northern and southern France united in the modern-ish period, the late medieval period, stuff happened. Things happened because of that. Those are different people, the northern and southern French. Like north and south France, even north and central France, and central and south France, those people are as different as the French and the Germans, as the Germans and the Belgians, as the Belgians and the Scandinavians, as the Scandinavians and the Swiss. Like, all of these different people are different people. All of these people that aren't French, they're all different people because they all have different names because they're different kinds of people. The French unified. The Germans are also different kinds of people. The German unification, was a similar thing. But the French people are all very different people. And in the north, let's see if I can get this right. Because I'm certain I'm going to say it backward. my memory is that in the north, France is very Catholic. And in the south, it was very heretical. Very, in the Middle Ages, the southern parts of France are where the Cathars, for instance, are said to have been. But the southern part of France is very much held on to and maintained the old ways and the old superstitions. Meaning magic. No, I had that wrong. The northern parts were very Catholic, but the southern parts, yeah, I said that right. The southern parts held on to the old ways. Because the northern parts were Catholicized by force, and the southern parts weren't. Catholicism, Christianity was kind of grandfathered in the south of France because it was there when the south of France was part of Rome. And so many conquerings later, the north of France also became Catholic. But the north of France became Catholic at the point of a sword. So the north of France was much more strict in their observances of Catholic doctrine. So the north of France has a much closer relationship with the Pope than the south of France has. The south of France, I want to say that the Burgundians actually are who had the false France, the false Pope during the schism. But those are very different people. And so that's actually true, and that's actually why Charlemagne is the way he was, and is remembered by history the way, in the specific ways that he is. And we can talk about that, I suppose. Maybe I'll have to break that out. But it's also true of why Eleanor of Aquitaine is remembered and was thought of the way she was. Because she, how did this go? She was from, I think I said that backward. I think the south of France might be more Catholic. Okay, I knew I was going to say this backward, and I always have to go to Eleanor of Aquitaine to double check it. The way it works is that the south of France, the nobility, the elite, the ruling class were extremely Catholic because they had been grandfathered in to leadership by their Roman Catholicism, by when the south of France was still Roman. Did I say that right? But the north was more heretical. So Eleanor of Aquitaine was from the north, and her version of Christianity was significantly more Celtic and Germanic. And so what I mean by that is that there was just a lot more sex and public nudity happening in the north of France than in the south of France. And that worldview, the less sex happening, fewer children, more fiscal and personal responsibility for the children, more doting love on a smaller number of children. That's a southern French idea as I'm pulling this apart out of my mind. And I told you I was going to say the first part. I knew I was going to get it wrong, and I'm probably still wrong. But if I understand correctly, the basically 1, 2, maybe 3 child households where you love those children and you raise them to maturity the best you can as a French idea. And again, we're talking about why France's population was so much smaller than Germany's. They only wanted 1 or 2 kids anyway, and Germany wanted 6 or 8 kids. peasant marriage in Germany, even middle class marriage in Germany, was about getting to fuck. That's why you're married. Whereas in France, it was about the children and having the legacy of the loved child. But that comes from a top-down worldview as well. The French, and they taught this to the English, and it's why we do it. The French have a way of life where their peasantry are expected to imitate in a very real way the nobility, the elite. So and this is getting to my points about being a chosen people and about being chosen and about enlightened monarchy. The monarch was meant to live the most philosophically best life. So the monarch was supposed to be a beacon of good Christianity, was supposed to be a beacon of charity, of generosity, of intelligence, of masculinity, the king was meant to be an aspirational figure and a role model to everybody in his domain in France. And so this is, they figured out pretty quick after Charlemagne, really, that dynastic rivalries tear a family apart. And so the French people wanted few children because few children meant less inheritance, less of the life work of the parent would be ripped apart and have to be spread among the children, because the French didn't do the British firstborn thing. We act like giving everything over to the firstborn. We in the United States act like inheriting everything to the firstborn was the way that it was done across all peoples, but that's not the way it was done across all peoples. The Germano-Franco-Celtic really answer to inheritance was to split it up among all the children. So the idea among the French was to have fewer children, and the idea among the Germans was to have lots of kids but not really anything to split up, right? That would change eventually. That would change. What have I been talking about? Not being French, right? You know, as the Americans were so worried about not being French. I feel for the French because Napoleon was just being a good leader. He was just doing what he was supposed to do. Because of enlightened despotism, the idea where because the ruler is enlightened, the people will imitate the leader's enlightenment and they will act as though they are enlightened despite themselves, I think is what I'm trying to point to. Like, that was part of how Wilhelm, that was part of how he fought World War I, was believing that Germany was so superior, and his personal righteousness was so great that the world's people would only naturally follow him. I don't know what I'm doing. I don't know what I'm looking for. There's got to be a way to raise that, because that's probably the fruit that I need. That's why I came back to this room. There's got to be a way to raise that, but I don't know what it is. I don't like those damn things. I'm not here to tell you that the Nazis are vindicated and that we have been unrighteously vilifying either German state. I actually think that he, I don't know. I could be wrong when I say that I think that he was trying to give Germany even too much credit. It'd be too lenient on First World War Germany as a nation state. Bismarck did everything he could to keep that country out of war. That wasn't profitable to it. And what profitable means is that the people that he went to war with would become German in a meaningful way. And that's what I'm trying to talk about. I'm trying to say that enlightened despotism was a last gasp to prevent democratic republican, to prevent democracy and republicanism, because those are different things. And the reason they were trying to stave off democracy is because if you have a functioning democracy, you have to constantly be evaluating who is making the decisions. Okay? So the reason that people like George W. Bush and Donald J. Trump say things that lead people to believe that they're actually in support of dictatorships, or at least of tyranny, is because the reason that they say these things is because tyrannies get things done. Okay? So when you're in a tyranny, now it just sounds terrible, but the word doesn't mean any badness. It doesn't mean anything bad. The value judgment tyranny is your own. You got to get over that. Okay? A tyranny is just where someone or a small group of people makes decisions, and those decisions are made. So when you work at a corporation, you work for a tyranny. The CEO is a tyrant. He's not asking your opinion, right? You don't get any say in how things are done. Like when you work at McDonald's, the way that a McDonald's burger is made is a tyranny. There is no way around it. And acting like that's a bad thing is the behavior of a stupid person. Okay, tyrannies aren't exclusively bad. In fact, if it weren't for many of history's tyrannies, we wouldn't be here today. Tyranny is absolutely necessary because what democracy can't do is make decisions quickly. That's been true since Athens. I mean, Xenophon wrote about that. How in states of crisis, in states of crisis, democracies always rely on tyrannies. That's why the power right now of the presidential executive order in the United States is so powerful, because the United States is always in a state of war. The United States has been in a state of perpetual war since World War II, and now not only are we in a state of war, but we're constantly in a state of crisis. But you literally don't even have to study the 19th century well to take away that those crises are manufactured. No government doesn't know that another people doesn't like it. Like he kept talking about how there were wars that could have happened that Germany could have gotten into much sooner than World War I, as early as like the 1880s, but they didn't get into them because their allies didn't actually have any reason to go to war with one another, and they didn't have any reason to instigate their ally going to war with their ally's enemy. Because when you play the Game of Thrones, when you play the Game of States, it's for keeps. You're trying to form a world empire. You're trying to increase your holdings without losing any. And so the 18th and 19th centuries, the ages of exploration and expansion, as I call them in my mind, I don't know if other people do, but the reason that those ages are important, and I've frequently hear people rhetorically ask, why is the modern world, why is the world even the historical world, why is Europe so obsessed with Rome? And it's because Rome did something so rare that it hadn't happened again for 1,000 years. They had a world empire. They had a continents spanning empire. Even though they didn't, what people by the 18th century, by the age of exploration, what they came to understand is that this has got to be something, and I just don't know what. They came to understand that the land masses, the people that you directly govern aren't the extent of your government, your territory's borders, your empire's borders. Empires have two border maps. They have the land that they control and that they directly govern. They might even have three, in fact. And as recent, by the time of the post-Enlightenment period, the more modern or the immediately pre-modern period, because in our own world, empires have three border maps. Okay, you've got the immediate land that you control, and then you've got the land that you control with your military. And then you've got the land that you control with your economy, okay? So, the reason that Britain isn't really interested in being an empire, and the reason that America is still so interested in British politics is because Britain is an American colonial holding now, and has been since the end of World War II. We own Britain's economy. I know that's true because the United States has been tanking Europe's economy to prevent Europe from being strong enough to compete with American shipping since the 1800s. We tanked Germany's economy twice on purpose. We tanked France's economy, and we've tanked England's economy multiple times. When you tank an economy, that's called wealth redistribution. So the market crash of 2008 was historically remarkable because the people that walked away from it rich were the same people who had gone into it rich. The only people that lost their hats in or their pants, as they say, in the 2008 market crash were the poor and the middle class. Historically, that's not what happens. Historically, the people that lose their britches, as they say, in market crashes are the rich, the world's elite. And it's a bad thing that they lose all that money because now there are new rich people. And so again, I talk a lot about the Yeoman Revolution of the 1400s. It's not called that anymore because it's impossible now to argue that it was a unified thing because the Yeoman Revolution came into history with the postmodern period when postmodern Europeans were trying to argue that Europe had been a unified whole idea since the fall of Rome, and all that history has done since is prove that idea false. And again, another thing that I've not introduced on the channel that I was listening to this and thinking about and wondering, well, why would that be? And have wondered why would that be, and not wondering as I'm listening why would that be, answering, well, why would that be, is French, German, and British medievalists, that is, medieval historians, hate American medievalists, and it's because American medievalists don't have any particular ideological or nationalistic axe to grind. so they don't have any particular bias. They don't have anything they're trying to prove. And European medievalists do have something that they're trying to prove about the unification of Europe, about the existence of Europe. And so these European historians hate these American historians because the American historians are doing basically what I'm doing, and I'm an American, so I would be doing what the people that I'm reading are telling me is true, right? And that's that Europe was never a unified whole. When it tried to be a unified whole with European concert with the European, what did they call it? Oh man, what was Woodrow Wilson's failed European Union? The Council of Nations and the United Nations, like all of these different things are because Europe isn't unified, because Europe was only unified under the concept that they all agreed that Christianity was the true religion. But that's not a unification. You can look at any of these people's political philosophy, just the way they relate to their peasants, just the way they treat their peasants, and you can see that these are different people. These are different people with different worldviews. And just because they all say, well, yeah, okay, Jesus is the light, the truth, and the way, the truth, and the light. Is that what he actually said? And just because they all say, okay, well, the Catholicism is the supreme arbiter of divine advisement, just because they all agree on that doesn't mean they agree on literally anything else. And that the only thing that kept them from conquering one another and trying to make a Europe spanning empire is that the Pope did secret and Machiavellian and even Bismarckian treaties with all of these different people and that with all these different people groups, and that's why leading into the age of exploration, all of these different people groups, their nobility, their kings, the people that were their tyrants, the people that made the decisions, all came from the same family. The reason they all came from the same family is because that family had proved that they were really good at abusing their children in such a way that they came out believing that they were Christ's. And yeah, that's child abuse. That is child abuse. And so one of the things about the 19th century that I find remarkable is that in the 18th century, they believed that if you controlled for a child's education and you controlled what a child learned and what a child believed, you could control the child's future. And so with that belief, enlightened despots began to institutionalize public education, thinking that if they could teach the children of their peasants, or at least the children of their middle class, to behave, if they could teach them to embody and agree with the same ideals that the kings held to be Enlightenment ideals, they didn't need enlightened despots anymore. And so that gets me back to what I have left undefined. Why did the despot need to be enlightened? Because enlightenment is the process of a life, it's a worldview, and it's a constant reevaluation and relearning. And the only people that are capable of it, the only people who are capable of it, are people with an immense amount of time on their hands and an immense amount of intellectual security. And what I mean by security is that they reserve for themselves the right to be wrong over the course of a lifetime. Okay? So enlightened despots were a problem, and modern historians talk shit about enlightened despotism because of the result, which was over legislation, because so few of them in a meaningful way actually did reserve the right to be wrong. They would legislate things that didn't need to be legislated. They were tyrannical to the point that they thought that they could codify in law how normal people, whether they be noble or peasant, because see, one of the things that late medieval, Renaissance nobility actually were able to do was regulate their kings. One of the things that these tyrants of the late medieval period and during the medieval period were able to do was legislate their nobility. And so by legislating their nobility, they were able to make the nobility do things like what Charlemagne did, where the nobility had to pay tithes for themselves, and they also had to pay tithes for their constituents. So they had to pay tithes coming and going. They had to pay taxes for themselves. They had to pay taxes for their constituents, right? So one of the ways that you could actually impact the lives of your constituents was to one of the ways that you could actually impact the lives of your constituents. Why is it doing that? Wait, is this the only sword? Okay, so this sword is the only one that can do that, but this one can do the other two? That's interesting. Okay. I don't remember what I was just saying. I was talking about enlightened despots and how they were the only people that could be enlightened, and they over legislated, because what medieval tyrants figured out is that you could legislate good behavior among your nobility toward the peasantry. Because what is true and what will always be true about the nobility is that they're trying to get out of having to provide for their peasantry. Because providing for the peasants is expensive. And you like your money to belong to you when you gather a lot of it. And that's true today of megacorporations. That this is why, in fact, the wealthy have gone the corporation model instead of the individual business owner. This is my business. They've gone the corporation model. It's not just to diffuse responsibility, but it is in a lot of ways to refuse responsibility, because if a business is a person, but that person makes its decisions not by fiat, not by tyrant, not by one person making decisions, but by a board of directors making decisions based on what's best for the business, then what you're talking about is the Lockean, I believe it was Lockean, it might have been Adam Smith, but you're talking about a Lockean economics. So you're talking about pre-psychology. What you're talking about is literally getting away with murder, right? You're talking about diffusing responsibility, and that's nobility are all about diffusing responsibility. The point of being a noble and not being a king, the reason that most noble people in history were willing to be subservient to a king when all you had to do was kill the king to be named the king, and the king was the higher position with the better prestige, better food, better women. The reason you allowed that was because of a diffusal of responsibility. If anything went wrong with the king's decision making, it was the king who died, not you, right? So if the king by fiat told you to do something and it went wrong, you could say, "Oh, that was the king's choice, not mine." Right? That's what being a manager in a mega corporation is. Who hasn't run across a manager, a shift manager, a general manager who takes responsibility for nothing? That's what being a noble is. And so in Germany, they replaced that nobility with the corporation. And so we act like we have no familiarity with it because we act like we can't translate German 18th and 19th century works of literature and philosophy to English. We act like we can't translate French to English. We act like these French and non-English speaking, we in the United States, non-English speaking writers didn't write, didn't think, didn't have anything to say about their own peoples. And so I'm at the hour and a half mark, and really what I find the most striking is that liberally educated college students, if you have a liberal degree, so if you have a college degree in the United States, you are a 19th century French noble in every way, and not metaphorically, not in a manner of speaking. You think and act like an enlightened French despot. And what I'm trying to get to and what I'm trying to say is that enlightenment was cynical. Universal male suffrage was cynical. They didn't give all men the right to vote in Europe and in the United States. They didn't give non-landholding, non-wealthy, non-Protestant or Catholic, depending on your region, but non-Christian males the right to vote because they believed in their heart of hearts, like either Locke or Hobbes or Smith, whichever one it was, that all men make all of their decisions based on their own best interests. They didn't do that because they believed that. They knew that's not true. It's not true. Men do not make their choices human beings do not make their choices based on what's in their best interest. Humans make their choices for a lot of reasons. Enlightened despots gave voting rights to all adult males because if they didn't give the voting right to all adult males, those adult males would go and fight for a foreign country for voting rights, because the vote is valueless. There's no inherent worth to voting. When you vote in a representative democracy or a representative republic, when you vote for your leaders, all you're doing is assuaging your loneliness. We've talked about how I accidentally hit my mic, so sorry for that loud noise. We've talked about how loneliness is the feeling that no one thinks the same way that you do. And so all that voting is temporarily curing. It's a panacea or Asuna is the word in Final Fantasy. Remedy. It's a temporary remedy for loneliness. You can say, well, at least the people in the capital think the way I do. And that worked. That still works. For my father's generation, for the Pepsi generation, it still works. Knowing that at least there are people who vote the same way you do or see the world in the same way you do. But I find that to be shallow in the extreme. Voting to feel like you belong to a group is religion. And he, the lecturer, to his credit, did keep pointing out that Marxism and these various political parties are a religion. They're not an ideology, they're a religion. And ideology isn't just an ideology. Ideology is religion. There's a Circus Survive song that I love that's titled Ideology is Theft, and Anthony Green is absolutely right to title that song in that way, if Anthony was the one who suggested the title. Because it usually seems to me like it's the lyricist who comes up with the title, because usually it seems to me the titles have to do with the vocal. So another thing that I've decided, because I'm trying to summarize what I've learned based on my hypotheses, and one of my hypotheses going into this that I'm noticing about the world is that the liberal doesn't know anything, but most especially the liberal doesn't know anything about themselves or where they've come from. So on Reddit, I got myself blocked from another Reddit thread, whole group subreddit again. I saw, what did I see? I was thinking about this the other day, and I remembered, and I was going to talk about it, and now that I want to talk about it, I don't remember what it was. I saw an article about how the Democrats are hawking for war in the Ukraine. And now that's not how a Democrat would sum up what that article was saying. But I really can't remember what the discussion was. But what I said was, imagine Democrats hawking for war, your Confederate flags are showing. And now every Democrat is going to go, nuh-uh, it's the Republicans who were Confederates. But that's just false. Because it was the Southern Democrats who were the Confederacy. It was the Southern Democrats who were pro-slavery. It was a Southern Democrat who caned a Northern Republican. I believe he was a Northern Republican. He might have been a Southern Republican. But it was a Southern Democrat who caned a Republican over the issue of whether slavery was in fact necessary to the American economy. And I'm going to tell you right now, it absolutely was. The only reason that we were able to compete with our agricultural goods, our cotton, etc., is because slaves. And you can argue, well, the cotton gin this, the cotton gin that, sure, but the slaves wouldn't have been picking the cotton anymore. They would have been doing something else with the cotton to refine it or whatever, but also for free. Because if your labor is free, you have no labor overhead. Now, a slave is not free. And that's basically why slavery disappeared, is because slavery is not, in fact, free overhead, is not, in fact, no overhead. There's the buying them in the same way that you have to buy a CNC machine if you're a CNC machinist, right? You have to buy the human being, and you have to feed them, and you have to maintain them in case they get sick or they get injured, right? And so the reason that labor became what it became, and unions in the labor market were necessary before the universal vote, right? Universal male suffrage, is because you didn't have a representative politician making rules about what your employer was and was not allowed to do before unions. So unions and unionization was the first step toward universal representative democracy, because you don't need to be, like we've talked about with the hyphenated American argument, you don't need to be the member of your labor union, the member of your church, the member of your political party, and an individual person. You need to be an individual person. And the vote frees you up to become an enlightened member of society, free of affiliation with cult. Whether it be your guild, your union, your religion, or your political party. And it is true that political parties are religions, because I listened to John of Center Place recently give the only bad lecture I've ever listened to him give, and that was on the discussion of the topic of religion. And if you don't translate the word religion to the Latin, and you don't start the discussion of what religion is at the Latin word religios, religio, if you don't start at the Latin or the Greek phrase, if you don't start with the first century philo and theosophical concept, you can go nowhere with the idea, because the idea immediately loses all lingual context after that period. The people using it after that period, especially once you enter the Dark Age, early medieval period, the word religion loses all context. To have religion in the medieval context meant to be a monk. It meant to isolate yourself from the world and only to practice your religion. But that isn't what it means today. To be religious means to be practicing and observing one or another worldview, one or another religion. But you can be religious and never step foot in a church in your own mind. You can call yourself religious but not step foot in a church. What religious in the world in the post Dark Age, early medieval vernacular means is in fact spiritual. But that's the exact opposite of what I think it was Augustine was doing when he divided the spiritual and the religious worlds. When he divided the spiritual and the religious world, so that with artifacts today of people who say, well, I'm religious but I'm not spiritual, or I'm spiritual but I'm not religious, right? He divided those for a very good reason, because I'm not gonna look up the, fuck it. I'll just look up the etymology. This is so much more of a winding, ridiculous mess than what I wanted it to be. I really thought this was going to be more succinct, and that I knew what I was thinking about when I sat down to record, and this is just in much the way of my gameplay here in East. It's just been a mess, just a disorganized mess. All right, so yeah, in Latin, religare, religion, religare, is the same root word of our relegate. So what a religare, or a religious person, a person with religion, or a person who was religious, is a person who has relegated themselves to the monastic life. It's a binding. It's a particular kind of binding, which keeps bringing me back to Hermeticism. Hermeticism is the binding. Hermes, the word comes from the word bind. Binding is important in Celtic and Nordic mythology as well. Binding is important in all of the mythologies. When you're talking about enlightenment, you're also talking about binding. And what you're talking about is you're talking about binding oneself to the light. Because, see, we just don't talk about this. You just don't hear people talk about it. You don't hear people understanding it. And you never hear people understanding it. You never hear people talking about it. You'll hear John of Center Place infrequently refer to the source. And it's because I think it's because religious and spiritual people are so concerned with sounding like a New Age whack job that they're unwilling to use the correct vernacular when the New Age whack job have made it sound New Agey and whack jobbish. And so the source doesn't have to be Plato's The One. It doesn't have to be. It is, but it doesn't have to be. So it doesn't have to be this New Agey, nonsensical pillar of light from which all things emanate. It is, but it doesn't have to be. You can think of the source as the supreme creator, or the supreme intelligence, the supreme being. But when you're talking about enlightenment, what you're talking about is binding the tether that is your third abstract self to the source directly. Okay. So you've probably heard, if you're anything like me, the concept of the silver thread, of the idea of an astral projection, which is horse shit, but whatever. The idea that there's a thread in near-death experiences. You'll hear people talk about there being a cord or a thread that's tied from the belly button to infinity, to something beyond comprehension. And if you follow that thread to the end, it leads to the near-death experience, and then the near-death experience, or the death experience, is the severing of the thread. And so that's probably just a visual metaphor, with the navel and all that, and it's a hearkening back to the thread, the navel that connects the child to the mother. But in the way that Hermeticism works, as above, so below, it only makes sense that there would be a thread tying our navel to the source, because the mother is the source of life in the beginning, and we are tethered to her in that way. So we would be tethered to the source of life at the end as well, and through all things, during the course is what I mean. At the end is when you would be severed from the source, because you return to the source, because what's being severed isn't you. In a lot of ways, the source is like the part that you hold of a tape measure. And you are the tape. You are the measuring. Not even in a lot of ways. This is actually a significantly better metaphor than you're going to give it. If you want to understand consciousness, listen to me talk. If you think that the mind-body problem isn't solved, just listen to me talk. Listen to this. The source is the spool, the box that you can't see into of the tape measure. If you were me, if you were ever a child and you held a tape measure, they're infinitely interesting because you don't get to see the spooling action on the inside. All you see is this semi-rigid metal tape that comes out and retracts in and goes to nowhere, and it's just so perfectly mysterious. Well, the source is the structure. You are the tape measure. Okay? Life is the pulling you out of the source to measure reality. So your body is you is pulling the tape measure out. Your body experience is the measurement of reality. You is comparing you against reality to measure it is literally what's happening. Okay? When the silver thread is cut, when death happens, when the Norn finally severs your thread with her mythological scissors, you are retracted from the body back into the source. And it's not until you are differentiated from the source, from the spool of tape measure, that you become you again. But that requires a body to do it. That's obvious to me. It's beautiful, in my opinion. Metaphor for the mind-body problem. What life is, what's going on. It doesn't have to be any great mechanical mystery. What God is, or how the supreme creator, the one mind, all of this highfalutin language, just capital it. How the universe was made, how life, everything happened, is so much simpler and so much less mysterious than we give it credit for. It did. Why it happened is because it did. The mechanism by which it happened is interesting, but we make it too important. The mechanism by which God blank isn't interesting it's only interesting to a liberal. And this is what I'm talking about when I reminded you that I told you that liberals are wizards. Whether they believe they're white or they believe they're dark wizards, they're wizards. And so it's only interesting how God did it to someone who hasn't figured out that they aren't God. Because how God created the universe is interesting to someone who thinks that they're God. Because if you believe, like Plato said, that you are God and there is no learning, there is only remembering, if you genuinely believe that means that when you figure out the mechanism by which God created the universe, you will remember how to do it again. And I'm struck in my mind over and over and over again now by how much sci-fi is about that. It's about the AI programmer's misunderstanding of who and what God is and what the Christian message is. God is the perfect creator because it sent to us its one and only Son, and we brutally murdered it. And it didn't retaliate. It didn't retaliate. So there used to be a cycle of retaliation, of disappointment, of squashing and recreating. Right? That's what the flood myth is. That's what the rainbow was, right? The whole, I won't do it again in this way was what the rainbow is. The rainbow was not a promise not to destroy the universe ever. It was a promise not to destroy the universe with water again. Okay. That's not much of a promise from a supreme God, especially when that supreme God is retaliatory, vindictive, and vengeful. And I know that vindictive and vengeful are the same word. Malicious, let's say. Because El is malicious. El is vengeful and malicious. El wants the non-Jewish people to hurt and to suffer. This is why I said in the last episode that the Jewish religion is just a waste of your time. And this is why why Jews just settled on atheism and cultural Judaism and not the religious Judaism. It's a waste of time because that God doesn't have any answer for the problem of good or evil. That God is malicious. That God is evil. That God is acts of the worst, most primal evils. That God is an extinction God. That God extincted multiple human species. And so if you're a 15th millennium human being and you know that the Denisovans have recently extincted, you know that God isn't good or evil. You know that God punishes you for your mistakes, that there is no forgiveness, there is no you will make this mistake again and I will not retaliate again and again and again, because that's what forgiveness is. Forgiveness is a determination not to retaliate over and over and over forever is what forgiveness is. It's for mercy. It's future mercy. And mercy is not retaliating. Mercy is not doing the violence that's within your ethical and moral right. Not just right, but in terms of Latin mercy, of Roman mercy, mercy was not doing the violence that was within your duty. To do mercy mercy was a gladiator not killing a defeated gladiator in combat. You would beg mercy. Mercy was a slave's master not destroying the slave for a theft or a misdemeanor. That's what mercy is. Mercy is not doing the violence that is within your right, within your purview, that is in fact your duty, that you are required to do. And so when France and Germany first, in fact, when France and Germany were not merciful to one another after their wars, when they took when they chose to do these economically ruinous post-war reconciliations, they guaranteed genetic hatred. Because when you can't prosper because of another people, actually because of another people, you hate that people. And then when you see a people getting reparations, let's say, because that's the modern term, but when you see a people by enlightened despotism, or even by enlightened democracy, enlightened liberal democracy, getting handouts, being not only allowed and not only encouraged, but being given mercy that you aren't given, it's not difficult. It is impossible not to hate that people. It is impossible. I flirt with hate in my heart every day for people, just because they're able to generate likes on Twitter and watches on their YouTube. Now, it's not their fault, and the lecture about finding meaning, I'm going to wrap up soon, I've actually done this. The lecture about finding meaning that I recently listened to said something, put into words something that I'd never heard before, but have thought myself in a pre-verbal kind of fashion. You've heard, I'm sure, the quote, not "I deny your worldview and replace it with my own," but "I violently disagree with your worldview, but I will fight to defend your right to have it." I violently disagree with that. That is relativist. And no, you will not fight for my right to have it. Because if I were to come down at the end of all of this, and I would just say, all right, at the end of my life, having read everything there is to read, having listened to everyone who claims to be worth listening to, I have decided that Jews should have been exterminated. I will never think that. But if I come down on that, you, person who says, I believe in your right to believe what you believe, and I will fight for your right to defend it even when I disagree with you, you will absolutely be in the front lines to fight against me when the neo-Nazis decide to take over the world again. It's not true that you will fight for the right of someone to hold an opposing view of yours. You will only fight when that opposing view threatens your ability to maintain your view. Conservatives threaten liberals' ability to maintain their view because liberals are wrong. Liberals threaten conservatives' ability to maintain their views independently because conservatives are outdated. Conservatives are always 15 to 30 years behind because it takes 30 to 60 years for a civilization to evaluate itself. And if conservatism as a worldview is institutionalized self-evaluation, critical self-evaluation, then it takes 60 years. And because of the rate of change, which is a completely meaningless statistic now, but because of the rate of change, because of how quickly things change now, conservatives don't have 60 years to make choices anymore. But liberals don't have 30 years. Liberals don't have 30 years of frenetic choice making, and they know it. This is why people like AOC and the Biden administration as such have to push all of their agenda now. This is why they were so upset with Obama, a communitarian president. Just interesting to me. Because I think I might have communitarian-inspired ideals, which is interesting, again, because I've never heard of communitarianism. I don't know if I said that in previous podcasts. I haven't looked it up. My research time, my independent research time, has gone into the APA, the American Psychological Association, because I've realized that American psychology, clinical psychology, scientific psychology is horseshit. It's just horseshit. It's horseshit as an association, it's horseshit as a philosophy, and it's horseshit as science. It's horseshit. It's 19th century in the worst way. And if I'm wrapping up, what I'm trying to say is this world that we live in wants you to believe that it's still the 19th century, that it's still the 1880s, and that war is still far away, and that economic prosperity is right around the corner, and that you, individual person, need to be fucking and raising a family and starting a business and living like it's 1889. The world wants you to party like it's 1889 because the world doesn't know what to do. Our leaders don't know what to do. Our educated class in the world are 19th century liberals with modern tools but not updated knowledge. The knowledge is not updated. When I listen to these people speak about the 19th century and then I study the topics that were in vogue in the 19th century, what I find is cognitive bias. I find arguments that are trying to support the arguments that were made in the 1800s, not arguments that are trying to disprove them but unable to. Marxists and socialists are among the world's stupidest human beings. Like, if there's a hell for stupid people, like if Dante's hell only exists for hierarchies of stupid choices, like if sin is stupid choices, the lowest and most tormenting rung of stupid hell would have to be reserved for journalists. Journalists are the stupidest people on the very planet. From Walter Cronkite all the way to the guy that's writing for your local paper. Journalists are the stupidest, most credulous human beings on the planet. And right after them would have to be American psychologists. Right after them would have to be the psychological institution. And I actually think that the psychological institution isn't who I was going to say, but you remember what I said leading up into that sentence better than I do. So that's where I spent my research thinking about maybe I need to draft a book about how clinical psychology and how ethics and morality and religion and government are all, what I was saying is ethics and morality, religion, government, everything is just trying to prove. Marxists and socialists are in the bottom rung. Marxists and socialists go into the second to last rung, right above journalists with psychologists and philosophers, because they're just fucking stupid as hell. Marx was proved wrong in his lifetime. And history is not an economic struggle. He wants to make a pre-gun germs and steel argument that history is a struggle over resources, but it's not a struggle over resources. War is a struggle over resources. History is a struggle for relevance. History is a struggle to be remembered. Like I say, the only people that weren't kings, the only people that are remembered in history, by history, who aren't kings, are the people who either capitulated to the kings and got things done through their capitulation, or the people who killed kings and became kings, or the people who got killed by kings, and the reason they got killed by the king was instructive for later people to not get killed by kings for same reason. This is the only reason we study history, is to learn what not to do. And our world leaders in the United States, meaning the United States, but our world leaders spent the 20th century just doing the same things that the 19th century had done, but with more efficacy, rather than, like, they did them better, but not for better reasons and not in better ways. So the reason that the poor were allowed to vote is because the poor men were allowed to vote is because poor men would vote conservative. That means they would vote for the crown, which means that the crown had an overwhelming majority in numbers of allies to whatever the king wanted. So the king was enlightened, and so the king would say, okay, we're going to do this and this and this and this good thing for the poor people, but never actually implement it. Like, that's how Russia did it for decades, centuries, is you say, yeah, we're going to give you all these things, and then never do them, because you the people don't actually have the ability to rise up and meaningfully harm the king. That became untrue with the Bolshevik Revolution, but how many revolutions did Marxist and communist Russia actually have? Like, how many times was that government overthrown only to be replaced by an equally corrupt and incapable government? And the reason that it was incapable is because of its education. It wasn't educated with truths, and it wasn't educated to learn from the past. Your education is filled with lies and propaganda. Mine is. It's frustrating. I hate it. But if you have a college education, you have a liberal European education. And what that means is that you're not not qualified to exist in the 20th century. You're not even qualified to live in the 19th century, because the 19th century, the things that you were learning and the things that you believed were only true cynically. Poor people only got the right to vote because they would vote for the king. They would continue to vote for the people that the king wanted them to vote for. They would continue to manipulate themselves. And how did the Republicans remain in office until Trump? By getting their constituency, their AstroTurf and grassroots constituency, to vote against their own interests. This is why the Republican Party is only populist. This is why liberals can't be populist. Is because they want to tell you what's best for you. And you're going, but no, wait a minute, I've been told that I am the only person who can know what's best for me. Right. Because you're the only person who can critically self-evaluate you. You are the only person who can look at your education and ask questions of it. But just because the Europeans learned in the 19th century that they couldn't control an entire continent of poor people by controlling for their education doesn't mean that the United States hasn't tried for 100 years. And doesn't mean that another thing that you don't understand and that you just don't appreciate if you're a liberal is that the reason that Europe isn't liberal is because liberal was only one class. It was only one political party. It was only one kind of the spectrum, so to be liberal was to be opposed to Democrats, and to be a Democrat was to be opposed to socialists, and to be a socialist was to be opposed to the working party. Like all of these things that the blue wants to cover up in our map of the United States, all of these ideologies, they're mutually exclusive. Like you can't have gender and sex rights and also workers' rights. You can't say that women have the same rights in the workplace as men and also want to have a civilization that's growing in population. You can't have an immigrant civilization that imports its workforce and a rich and strong and healthy middle class. All of these things that the Democrats want to do are mutually exclusive. They work against one another, and they've worked against one another for 200 years. I'm not saying this because I'm cynical and I just don't like liberals. I'm saying this because they didn't work together in Karl Marx's lifetime. Like there's a reason that utopian socialists are called utopian socialists. It's because socialism is a utopia. Utopia is a word that means no place. It's impossible. It's impossible. Because people aren't interested in the benefit of the group. They're interested in the benefit of themselves. The way that Americans get people to vote for the interest of the group is by asking if the group's benefit has benefited you individually. What do we say? Is your life better after 4 years? Not, is the country collectively stronger? That's what we used to ask. Is the country collectively stronger? But when you ask, is the country collectively stronger, that's asking if the country is collectively expanded in either its resources or its material wealth or its actual territory. So in the 19th century, you could say, has the United States gotten actually stronger? And the Monroe Doctrine said yes. But after World War II, there was no stronger to get. The only way the United States could get stronger, the only way the country could get stronger was to become an actual totalitarian republic and go and knock China and Russia off the playing board, because we'd already knocked Germany, Japan, France, England, and Spain, and Italy never meaningfully was on the board. Italy had stopped wanting to be on the board. The push immediately leading into World War I among Italian youth to be on the board as men in the 19th century sense of manliness was the first time in over 1,000 years Italians had any interest in world politics. And the lecturer did not mention that or even attempt to bring that across. He just wanted to act like Italians had always been pro-rebuilding Rome. But like, even when he was talking about Florence, not even as a result of the Renaissance, or not even during the Renaissance, after the Renaissance, he was talking about how, even in Italy, Florence preferred not to consider itself Italian. And it's like, well, right, Florence has always been that way. Italy has been that way for 1,000 years. Like, he wanted to talk about like the Piedmont thinking of itself as separate from the south of Italy. And it's like, yeah, the Piedmont of Italy thought of itself as separate from the south of Italy during the Roman era. Like, has he never heard of the two Roman civil wars? The two Roman civil wars were the North against the South. That's how Italy has always been. And after the collapse of Rome in the West, Italy itself was exhausted with world empire. And that's something that I don't think that Europe realizes, is that they're exhausted with world empire. I think that Europe, and to a lesser degree, the liberal blue metropolitan parts of the United States, so the Northeast, New England, New York, and California of the United States, think that just because they're rich and they've survived the 2008 market crash, that means that they get to be isolationists now because they're anti-globalism. And it's like, nope. Globalism happened. Globalism was going to happen. Globalism wasn't something that happened on purpose because the various empires were trying to exploit those things. Were trying to exploit one another, or were trying to knock one another off the board. Globalism happened because those empires opened up their decision making to public opinion, and public opinion wants permanent growth. Public opinion, once you make even your poor boards of directors for your actual nation, no one wants anything other than growth. Because if you're growing, then you're not rich yet. But if you've stagnated, then you are what you are now, because there's not perpetual growth. There's not going to be a permanent room for everyone to expand in the social hierarchy. But capitalism, if the Marxists are right about anything, has proven definitively that permanent, unchecked growth is impossible. That's what a cancer is. And permanent, unchecked, growing free markets will eat your civilization from the inside. But so will liberalism. If your words don't mean anything, if they only mean what they need to mean for you to win, I don't know what I'm trying to do in this puzzle, so I might have to look at a strategy guide or something. I don't know if I have an item. I don't think I have an item that'll help me. Oh, I haven't used this in a while. I should be wrapping up, is what I'm trying to say. I was going to try to wrap up. I don't know what this episode was about. Thoughts on the 19th century and how the 19th century world, our world, is still in the 19th century. I don't have a takeaway for you. Be a member of the 21st century. That's my takeaway. Thanks for listening. I'll talk to you later.